Hey everyone, this is Nick with Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason, and you're listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. Today we're going to dive into the topic of, who are the FinOps team members in your organization? And this is going to sound a little familiar if you've been listening to the show for a while. We've touched on the various roles and the various players, the stakeholders who are within your organization, but we actually want to dive down into actually, who is going to be hands-on with the work, not just who's going to lead the initiative, not just who are, the personas that have an interest in it and who may want to push FinOps initiatives or informed ignore FinOps initiatives in to whom you need to convince. But this is actually, we're going to dive into what does a team look like when you start to structure a team around FinOps initiatives. What does that cost? What does that do to your ROI, et cetera? So Jason, I guess we should probably start with a recap. Who are, in earlier episodes, real quickly, we touched on who are the key players, who are the potential stakeholders, who's potentially going to be leading the initiative, not necessarily doing the work, so we can set up who kind of surrounds today's topic.
Well, you have your FinOps people, which is really kind of a budding or kind of a new market. There aren't a lot of titles out there. There are now some coming up, right? So you have FinOps practitioners or engineers. You have executives, which will span, CTO, CIO, CFO, and CEO. It could all be personas.
They all have different wants and needs, right? I mean, each of those personas kind of has different.
Yes.
And there's a common mistake, and I think it's worth repeating. Sometimes people think CFO should be driving this initiative. They should not. It's actually probably going to come from the technology organization. No. Remember, this technology spending is probably only 2 to 3, maybe 5% of a CFO's domain, and they're far more worried about things like debt covenants and performance for the next quarter, and making sure that they have strategic activities potentially that they're focused on, not something that's 3% of their budget. Carry on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they care to the extent on how it negatively affects the bottom line and how it can improve it and staying within budget, right? And like on FinOps website, there's a persona section that actually goes through, like we won't go through it on the podcast in detail, but it goes through what the motivations, frustrations, and what the key metrics are for each of these personas that we talk about. And they do a pretty good job of doing it. There's line of business or product owner, would be also another stakeholder. Engineering and operations is an obvious one, right? Because
that's who we're going to be talking about today.
People that we talk about,
absolutely,
correct.
Yeah. There's also procurement,
and then you got finance and maybe IT finance and procurement are also could or are potential stakeholders in
perfect. FinOps. Yes. And then we did touch on in an earlier episode a little bit about who might lead the initiatives, and that can be different people within the organization. It might be a CTO that's pushing it, depending on the size of organization. It might be your IT business operations. The folks who are, the financial wing of IT might be pushing it. It might be nested within your enterprise architecture, your program management, your cloud center of excellence, just depending on the org structure of your organization and who is being tasked with optimization initiatives for that organization. And it could also be yourselves. You as the listener might say, hey, I know there's an opportunity here and I really want to push this, and this is the career path I want to take. That's a viable path as well. So we want to dive into, okay, you've convinced the stakeholders. It is a driving force within the organization. Now, what does that team look like? Who is made up? Who makes up that team? So, Jason, diving into sort of the engineering operations, maybe even some potentially some business folks that are involved there. What's one of the first sort of roles that we want to dive into?
Probably data engineers, I would say, is probably first. And as FinOps defines it, these are the people. This is the role or the function that basically grabs the data and gets it to you in a format in which you can understand it, allocate it, optimize it, and all of that. So I think it's probably the first role or function that we should talk about.
Somebody has to ingest the data. without it,
It's unbelievable.
you can't do anything.
You can't have an analyst it.
Analyst.
You can't have an automation engineer automation it.
Well, and when we talk about the principles of FinOps, you can't map data if you don't have data. So you first you have to ingest that data.
Yeah, I know. It seems like it's so funny, but it is. Yeah, well, you data engineers, somebody that's going to grab that data, ingest it, and get it to the appropriate people in the format that is agreed upon, in the language that is agreed upon, right? Because it's not just about ingesting the data, it's about normalizing it potentially. It's about presenting it in a way that the entire team is going to understand what these things mean. And that's also a concept that we've talked about multiple times. It's terminology. That is also an important part of ingesting and the data and normalizing the billing data as well. So, which is part of that.
We've seen this. I mean, we've talked to customers, prospects who've become customers, and one of the problems they have is actually that they're paying for these data engineers, right? That ends up kind of being this early issue that they deal with is I need to optimize, I need to go achieve a certain maybe cut to my cloud bill or whatever it is, and then almost following that is, but it's really expensive for me to do this because I'm putting a software engineer, I'm putting a data engineer on this, and it's taking a ton of their time. It's one of the early complaints we hear. It happens as early as maybe $250,000 to $300,000-$400,000 a month in spend. You start seeing a role become more and more tied to this. Often a couple of roles because there may be one person responsible, but they, of course, sometimes are out, and so you need help there.
Yeah, I would say, and we see it there because it's not that that's when we first see the need, the problem at that spend. That's when we first start seeing people try to solve it, or solve it through
people to
effective
solve it.
means.
Sorry, yes.
Dedicate people to solving it. Absolutely. I just wanted to make that clear. And that what we typically see is more around $100,000 a month in spend is when companies already have this problem. It's just when they're at that amount of money, they're trying to absorb this work with existing people. And
it's usually a top-down approach.
Staff.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
Like, we need to optimize this. We got to stop spending so much money. Please, fix this. That's the sort of activity we see. Or we see bring in outside consultant and do a one-time optimization.
Correct. And so, but really a little bit of investment even earlier on in the process where you're actually dedicating people to understanding this internally and not just updating a spreadsheet, which is typically what we see between 100 and 250,000 a month is some person internally has a spreadsheet and then they're trying to get everybody to make sure it's accurate. And I can't tell you how many times that we've been sent this spreadsheet, right? The spreadsheet that the company uses, so that we can get an understanding of it. Every single time I find an inaccuracy compared with what we have in our
there's
system.
Always an error.
And it's always. And it's primarily because there's a human interpreting some of the stuff that goes in there. Not everything's automated. And so, I think that definitely you start to see the roles become clearer. You start to see dedicated people around the $250,000, $300,000 a month. But a better plan or maybe help from a company that knows how to do this more towards $100,000 a month and up would be a wise thing to think about.
So the next role in that chain is you just mentioned it. There's somebody who's the analyst, and I've seen this manifest in a couple of ways. But they're supposed to interrogate the data and start to make decisions around where there's opportunity, and to be able to tell the story of what's happening within the cloud spending. Sometimes is actually an analyst in the organization. I've more often seen this someone who's in a leadership role, in fact, be the analyst trying to interpret this data. In that, in and of itself, has its own sorts of I don't know what the right word is, cost to it. Maybe there's an opportunity lost
again
there.
Yeah, I think it I hate to beat a dead horse here, but you can't hand over something that isn't a process to an analyst and say, you should go figure out what I'm paying for this over here.
Right.
You can't do that until you have all of these other things that we're talking about as like the foundational framework of FinOps. It's really difficult to utilize, I don't want to say lower, like earlier in career talent to do the analyzing if you, as the leader of that department, don't understand what they should be analyzing, right? And so that's why we see it earlier on, before companies know they need to make an investment in it, they try to use who they have internally, and they end up chewing up management and leadership time doing analyst type things because they didn't take the extra time just to make sure that they had these things put in place.
And this is, I mean, we're talking about fairly small spending here too. I mean, we really are. We're talking $250,000, $500,000 a month is fairly small spending.
$1 million a year in the cloud and up.
Yeah, and so we've run into organizations that are trying to form teams when they're spending $8 to $10 million a month, and trying to figure out that ROI based on what it's going to cost to actually put the team in place. So we are talking about sort of dual rolling early on in some of the issues that can happen there. But this is how you'll see it take form inside the organization. No horses, by the way, were hurt in the explanation there, or in the recording of this podcast. So the very next role would be,
we're not making glue.
The very next role would be cost engineers. So you now have to have, and I'm using that term lightly. It's probably is truly a DevOps engineer, a cloud engineer, someone who has experience in understanding what forces can drive spending and how to optimize around those. So this is not yet someone who's automating. This is the person who has a lot of experience identifying where the opportunities are and can point to them and understand them and help drive organizations around them.
Not to use the same reference from before, horses. This cost engineer is the glue that gets embedded in all of the teams that do the work. Come on, man. You can tie
I can see this episode's already going sideways.
But I mean, this role, this function, whoever does this is helps each one of the teams that are a part of this process, because data engineers don't have to live in the same functional unit, right? Like in organizations, you could have many units that have to do similar functions that all roll up here. And so a cost engineer becomes extremely effective once you have many different units contributing to your FinOps practice. And they help keep all of those teams aligned and doing the same thing from the perspective that you mentioned.
Right, and these folks are often, not always, but often centralized into some sort of infrastructure team or into some sort of cloud ops team, and they have a ton of experience across many different products, usually deploying in the cloud. It gives them the opportunity to see issues, especially around kind of utilization and how an app is potentially leveraging infrastructure, maybe how configuration is not necessarily optimal for how an app needs to leverage that infrastructure. A classic example, we always use it, I start up an S3 bucket, I turn on versioning, and now I have an app that's using it just as a site to trade data. Well, that's a really bad practice from a configuration perspective, but you might have a policy that says every time we deploy cloud storage, we turn on this type of versioning for our internal regulation in order to retain data. Well, if it's just a place you're exchanging data, you're always going to delete it. It's temporary. That's a really bad configuration for how the app operates. So it gives one example of where a cost engineer can see that across, hundreds, maybe thousands of deployments, and can see it across many different products and apply those lessons learned to other products. So that's why you want to have somebody with this experience who sees it all the time. Okay, So, well, I think this is probably worth touching on, Jason. You've brought this point up in the past. Is it's worth taking those individuals who have all that experience, and as you grow them and you have more and more of them, is actually planting them into the engineering teams for the business units. So as you have, big lines of business who are leveraging a ton of cloud, having someone who takes that wealth of experience and then specializes, it'll force the business to think upfront from the architecture side, because optimization is architecture, architecture is optimization. Forces them to think about that upfront instead of having to catch it after it's already a problem.
Right. I completely agree. Everything that we talk about is extremely important, though, isn't it? It
is.
Everything we talk about is extremely important. By the way, this is going to be our most viewed episode, Nick. Most viewed episode, because we got a little, I don't know, like slap happy a little bit, maybe a little bit. I don't know. We're having fun.
So next would be the automation. This would be the actual implementation, right? So now you're going to have some automation. You're going to have some engineers who actually go and implement what needs to be done. So that's kind of the fourth part of the team here.
And they help set the standards for how things get deployed, architected, optimized from a creation standpoint, whether you call them templates, they could be Terraform templates, whatever they are. They help set the stage there. They also help manage and make sure that those things are adhered to throughout the organization as well. So, that's, again, not the first thing you do, right? I mean, it's in the name, right? Automating is almost the last thing that you do. In any process, right? First, you got to make sure that you understand what the process is, and then you document the process, and then you automate said documented process. And so that's why we've left that from a technical perspective. That is the last thing that you implement, and the last thing that we talked about.
Anyone who's followed me on LinkedIn knows that I hammer on this all the time, is that engineers like to automate first, myself included. And actually, it's the last thing we should be doing. We'll get to it really quickly, but we've got to have data-driven decisions that push us towards automation. Otherwise, you automate bad, and bad things happen.
How many times have we seen? I automated that. Yeah, you automated it so that there was no life cycle policy on versioned S3 buckets. It was automated, but automated in a way that increased our cost tenfold on S3. That's a common story.
No EBS cleanup is another common story. I disconnected all the EBS volumes but didn't delete them, and I've redeployed my infrastructure every day for months now.
That was another one. That was another good one. Yeah, it's like, that's not there. That's automated in our dev process. Oh yeah, it's the termination of the EC2 instance. Yeah, right. It was. It wasn't, but it was. It actually was. See, that's the thing. It's such a beautiful answer, because if I as an engineer can say, I automated that, it gives the impression that it was solved. But automation in and of itself is not a solution, but it is said like it's a solution every time you hear it. And really, when you think about it, the solution is the process. The automation.
It is, and it's also confirmation that you've done what you wanted to have done. That is often a piece that's missed, because we get really excited about automating things. I do. So,
Me too, man. Like Zapier is my favorite tool, of anything, of any SaaS tool I've used in the last X number of years. And that's all it is an automation tool.
So the final role here in building a FinOps team, the hands-on team that's going to go do the work, is really having a team lead, right? So there's someone who's going to drive these efforts and organize them and drive them. And so we're talking about 4, 5, 6 folks here that are in a team. Obviously, you're not doing this when you're spending $100,000, $200,000 a month. You have folks in I'm sure many of you have experienced this. You have folks who are kind of doing dual duty, or who are potentially well, they're filling maybe many of the roles, or they have another job and they're doing this partially, and that's totally normal. Get that. But thinking about the roles that need to be fulfilled even early on helps you in thinking about the types of work that needs to be done in getting that those processes and people sort of in place, the set of responsibilities that need to happen. It's really important.
And also think about the growth as well.
Right.
Over, right. You know, it's one thing to think about this team where you are today spending $3 million annually in cloud.
Right.
But if that number is projected to be $5 million in 3 years, don't expect to be able to accomplish the same things with the same number of people.
That's correct. And when folks are doing internal ROI calculations, this is often the thing they forget. We see this all the time, is that they forget these folks, and then when they go in, they look for some expertise to help. We're not talking about us. We'll talk about us in just a second, but they're looking for some outside help to potentially accelerate them. Sometimes they're missing that cost, and so it can look like they're not going to get the sort of benefit that an expert coming in and, you know, doing a very quick engagement to optimize is going to deliver them. And in fact, you know, the ROIs there are generally much better. And we certainly think in terms of ROIs when we look at the data. You know, Tenacity, when we built it to really stop the curve and time it takes for data engineers to pull in and normalize this data and make it really easy. I mean, we literally turned it into a 15-minute process, and it just happens then. And instead of having to have one or multiple people who are very expensive to do this, and you know, as we've progressed the platform, we think about each of these roles. You know, we've now progressed the platform to help with the analysis. We've progressed the platform to have advisory services that are delivered by FinOps practitioners that actually help with the cost engineering and the analysis. And we even have full service where we have folks that help with automation. We're thinking in terms of those core teams and how we drive adoption. That is because we've gone into these organizations and we've seen this. So if you're on this journey, you want to be thinking about these roles. You want to be thinking about how these roles are going to be built into the organization, who's going to be dual duty, make sure that you're actually costing them. What you don't want is that you're out trying to hire a bunch of roles that are going to make it more expensive for you to keep your environment optimized than the actual trade-off.
Well said.
Well, at 22 minutes, I think we're probably solid on this episode. So that's a wrap. Head out to tenacity.ai, download the Cloud Cost Optimization Handbook. Of course, hit us up out on Reddit/r/Cloud Cost Optimization. Drop your comments, ask your questions. We're there to help out. And of course, you know, like, subscribe to the podcast, share it out, please. Hit us up on YouTube. We're always looking for your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned.